The morning they told us it was over, I watched a woman eat her own reflection. Not literally. Not yet. But she was standing at the glass door of an abandoned Walgreens on Route 9, pressing her face into it, licking the surface in long, mechanical strokes while her fingers clawed at the frame. Her clothes were intact. Her hair was brushed. She still had both shoes on. And that was the part that made my hands shake on the steering wheel, because she didn't look sick. She looked like someone who'd simply decided that glass tasted good. My name is Joel Marin, and 3 hours before that, the President of the United States had declared the VRIS-7 epidemic functionally contained. I was driving south on a 2-lane Virginia back road with my younger sister Nora, asleep in the passenger seat, and a man named Duncan Pace, buckled into the back with a Remington 870 across his lap and a rosary wrapped around the pump. Duncan was not a religious man. He'd taken the rosary off a dead state trooper outside of Culpeper because the beads helped him count. He said it kept his hands busy. I didn't ask what he was counting. We'd been moving for 11 days. The containment announcement had played on every surviving AM station that morning. Looped, clipped, delivered in that smooth governmental cadence designed to sand down panic into compliance. The outbreak has been contained to designated zones. Citizens in cleared corridors are advised to return to normal activity. The nation thanks you for your patience. Nora had woken up long enough to hear the tail end of it. She'd looked at me with the expression she'd been wearing since Fredericksburg. Not fear, but a fatigue so deep it had carved new lines around her mouth. She was 26. She looked 40. "You believe that?" she asked. "No." "Good." She went back to sleep. Duncan from the back seat said nothing. He just rolled a bead between his thumb and forefinger and watched the tree line pass. We'd left Arlington 11 days ago after the second perimeter collapse. I'd been an EMT. Not a paramedic, not a doctor, not anyone important enough to be folded into the government response. Just a guy who knew how to stabilize a broken femur and could drive an ambulance without clipping parked cars. When the hospitals started locking their doors and FEMA began running silent convoys through the suburbs at 3 a.m., I knew the language of that silence. It was the sound of a system eating itself from the inside. I found Nora at her apartment in Rosslyn. She'd barricaded the door with her bookshelf, philosophy texts, and a yoga mat wedged under the handle. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Not because there was no food, but because she'd seen her neighbor, Gerald, walk into the courtyard and stand perfectly still for 9 hours before dropping to all fours and crawling into the drainage grate. She told me this without crying. She told me this the way you'd explain a math problem you'd gotten wrong. Duncan we picked up at a gas station south of Manassas. He was sitting on the curb with the shotgun across his knees and a backpack full of canned peaches. He'd been a long-haul trucker out of Pennsylvania, caught mid-route when the interstate closures hit. His rig was jackknifed in a ditch 2 miles back. He didn't ask where we were going. He just said, "You have room?" And I said, "Get in." That was day 3. Now it was day 11. And the government was telling us the breathing had stopped. But I'd seen the woman at the Walgreens. And 3 miles before that, I'd seen a dog sitting in the middle of the road, perfectly still, with something dark and wet hanging from its jaw that I chose not to identify. And the birds had been wrong for days, not absent, which would have been expected, present but rearranged. Crows where sparrows should have been, hawks at ground level, a silence in the canopy that felt architectural, as though something had redesigned the hierarchy of what was allowed to make noise. The radio kept looping, functionally contained. I turned it off. We needed fuel, and that meant stopping. And stopping meant deciding who stayed with the car. This had become our only real argument. Not ideology, not rationing, not direction. Just this. Who stays, who goes, who watches. Because in 11 days, we'd learned that the most dangerous moment wasn't the encounter. It was the pause before one. The seconds where you stood still long enough for something to notice you'd stopped moving. I pulled into a Sunoco of a county road near Charlottesville. The pumps were dead. No power. But Duncan had figured out on day 5 how to pry the underground cap and siphon directly from the reserve tank with a length of garden hose and a hand pump he'd fabricated from a bicycle tire inflator and duct tape. It took 20 minutes of standing in the open with your back to the world. "I'll pump," Duncan said. He always said it first. Not out of bravery. Out of a calculated selfishness he was honest about. If something comes, I'd rather be the one holding the hose. Means I'm already standing. You two in the car, you're sitting. Takes you 3 seconds to get upright. 3 seconds is a coffin. He wasn't wrong. Duncan had a way of reducing survival to geometry. Angles, distances, seconds. He never talked about feelings. He talked about vectors. Nora and I waited in the car. She was awake now, sitting with her knees pulled up, watching the tree line through the passenger window. She did this thing, this cataloging, where she'd scan left to right, pause, scan again, like she was photographing the landscape in strips. She'd been a research assistant at Georgetown, studying pattern recognition in primate behavior. She'd once told me that humans were terrible at detecting motion in their peripheral vision, but excellent at detecting stillness that shouldn't be there. A shape that doesn't sway when the trees sway. A shadow that holds its ground when clouds move. That's what you look for, she'd said. Not the thing that moves, the thing that doesn't. I watched her scan. I watched Duncan's back as he worked the pump, the hose snaking into the ground like a vein tapped open. "Joel." "Yeah." 2 o'clock, behind the dumpster. I looked. Didn't see anything. Garbage bags, a collapsed cardboard display for motor oil, weeds pushing through the asphalt. "Just wait," she said. I waited. 15 seconds, 20. Then I saw it. Not movement, but the absence of movement. A shape behind the dumpster's right edge. A shoulder, maybe. A curve that didn't belong to the metal. It was perfectly still. Not hiding still. Not scared still. That meant it was processing. We'd learned. Everyone had learned. Those of us still left. That VRIS-7 didn't turn people into movie zombies. Not at first. The early stage was something worse. The infected didn't charge. They didn't groan. They stood. They watched. They calculated with whatever remnant of cognition the virus left intact, and they waited until proximity crossed some invisible threshold that flipped the switch from observation to action. The CDC had called it the assessment phase, before the CDC stopped calling it anything. The internet, in its last gasping weeks, had called them breathers, because you could hear them. In the silence, in the still air, you could hear the wet, labored rhythm of their breathing. Fast, shallow, like a dog panting in slow motion. The virus did something to the lungs, thickened the tissue, made every breath audible. They could stand in the dark for hours, and you wouldn't see them. But you'd hear that sound, that slick, biological metronome. "Duncan," I said, just loud enough. He didn't turn. He'd heard the tone. He simply let go of the pump handle and let his right hand drift to the Remington leaning against the pump housing. "How far?" he said. 40 feet, behind the dumpster. One visible doesn't mean one present. Nora reached behind her seat and pulled out the tire iron we kept in the footwell. She didn't say anything. She just held it. The shape behind the dumpster shifted. Not toward us. Laterally, an inch, maybe 2. A recalibration. I could hear it now. That breathing. A faint, rhythmic rasp carried on the still air like a whisper with no words. Duncan picked up the Remington. He didn't rack it. It was already chambered. "We have enough fuel," he said. It wasn't a question. Enough to get somewhere. Then we get somewhere. He pulled the hose, capped the tank, walked backward to the car without breaking sightline with the dumpster. Got in, closed the door softly. I started the engine. In the rearview mirror, as we pulled away, I saw the shape step out. It was a teenager. A boy, maybe 15, in a high school football jersey. He stood in the middle of the lot and watched us leave with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. The breathing followed us for a quarter mile before the wind took it. The plan, if you could call the thing we had a plan, was to reach a place called Harmon's Crossing. It was a rural community about 90 miles southwest, near the Blue Ridge, where a former colleague of mine, a paramedic named Ava Shin, had sent a shortwave broadcast on day 6 claiming they'd established a defended perimeter with 23 survivors, running water and a generator. I trusted Ava the way you trust someone who once restarted a child's heart in the back of a moving ambulance, without flinching. She was precise. She didn't exaggerate. And in her broadcast, she'd used a phrase that convinced me. We're not safe, but we're organized. Anyone telling you they were safe was lying. Ava was telling me she was prepared, and that was worth driving 90 miles for. The problem was the route. Direct roads were out. I-64 was a graveyard of jackknifed semis and military barricades that may or may not still be manned. The secondary highways were passable but exposed, running through small towns where the infection had moved fastest because people trusted their neighbors long past the point where their neighbors were still people. That left the tertiary roads, the farm routes, the unnamed gravel paths that wound through the mountains like the land was trying to hide its own veins. Duncan had a paper atlas, an actual Rand McNally, 2019 edition, bought at a truck stop in Harrisburg before the world got quiet. He navigated by page number and county line, tracing routes with a carpenter's pencil, marking dead ends with small X's. He'd filled 9 pages with X's already. "There's a bridge crossing at Tyner Creek," he said from the back seat, pencil moving. "If it's intact, we cut through the valley and hit Route 56 south. That puts us within 30 miles of your woman's coordinates. She's not my woman. She's the reason we're driving into the mountains instead of toward the coast, like every other breathing person with a functioning brainstem. That makes her yours." Nora turned in her seat. "The coast is a death trap. Everyone's funneling there. More people, more infected, more collapse." "Didn't say I disagreed," Duncan said. "Said it was his." This was Duncan's way. He filed people into categories of accountability. If you made the call, you owned the outcome. It wasn't cruelty. It was a framework that kept him from having to feel responsible for anything except his own trigger discipline. I understood it. I even respected it. But it meant that if Harmon's Crossing was empty or overrun, or a lie Ava told to a radio she hoped someone was monitoring, that weight was mine. I'd carried weight before. In the ambulance, every decision was triage. Who gets oxygen first? Who gets the stretcher? Who gets the blanket over their face? You learn to make those calls fast and grieve them slow, and I'd been grieving in installments since long before the outbreak. My mother had died in 2019. My father had remarried and moved to Tucson and stopped returning calls. Nora was the only family I had left who still felt like family, and I'd almost lost her to a barricaded apartment and a neighbor who crawled into a drain. So yes, Ava was mine. The drive was mine. And if it killed us, that would be mine too. We crossed the county line into Nelson County around noon. The road narrowed, climbed, and the cell towers disappeared behind ridgelines that rose like the spines of buried animals. The last of the AM stations faded to static. The containment announcement was gone. For the first time in 11 days, there was no official voice telling us what was true. Just the road, the trees, and the sound of our own breathing, which we'd all, without discussing it, learned to keep quiet. The bridge at Tyner Creek was intact, but someone had tried to burn it. Scorch marks climbed the wooden railings on the south side, and the center planks were blackened and warped but still holding. Whoever had started the fire had either been interrupted or changed their mind. There was a red plastic gas can lying on its side at the far end, still a quarter full, cap off. The smell of gasoline mixed with the creek water and the sweet rot of late autumn leaves made something in my stomach tighten. "Somebody wanted to cut this route," Nora said. "Somebody didn't finish the job," Duncan replied. He was already out of the car, walking the bridge on foot, testing each plank with his weight before waving us forward. I drove across at idle speed, feeling the wood groan beneath the tires. The creek below was shallow and fast, maybe knee-deep, running over smooth stones. On the far bank, someone had spray-painted a message on a boulder in red. "They can swim." I didn't know if that was true. I filed it with the other rumors we'd collected, like dark currency. They can climb. They don't eat. They remember your face. They sleep standing up. They gather at the sound of engines. Some of these were true. Some were panic wearing the clothes of information. The trouble was, you couldn't tell the difference until the moment it mattered. And by then, the distinction was academic. Past the bridge, the road climbed into a narrow valley flanked by steep ridges thick with bare hardwoods. The leaves had dropped early this year. Or maybe it was late. Time had become unreliable. And the forest floor was a carpet of brown and amber that muffled everything. Sound behaved differently here. Our engine echoed off the ridges and came back to us delayed, a ghost of ourselves following 100 yards behind. Duncan noticed it too. "Kill the engine." "What?" "Turn it off. Coast. We're announcing ourselves to the whole valley." He was right. I turned the key and we drifted forward on the gentle downslope, the tires crunching gravel in a whisper. In the sudden quiet, I could hear the creek behind us, the wind in the bare branches, and something else. Distant, rhythmic, mechanical. A banging, metal on metal, maybe a quarter-mile ahead, steady as a heartbeat. Nora heard it too. She sat forward, her hand on the dash, her eyes tracking the road ahead where it curved around a rock outcrop. "That's not natural," she said. "Could be a generator," I offered. "Generators hum. That's percussive." She was right. It was a striking sound. Deliberate, measured. Not frantic, not random. Something or someone was hitting a metal surface at precise intervals, and it carried through the valley like a bell with no church. We coasted around the curve and found its source. A man was standing in the middle of the road next to an overturned pickup truck, swinging a tire iron against the truck's exposed undercarriage. He was alive. Clearly, unmistakably alive, because he turned when he saw us and raised one hand while the other kept swinging. He was tall, gaunt, wearing a canvas work jacket and jeans dark with grease. His face was weathered and unshaved, his eyes too alert for infection. I put the car in neutral and let it roll to a stop 30 feet away. "Don't get out," Duncan said. "He's not infected. Didn't say he was." The man stopped swinging. He planted the tire iron on the asphalt and leaned on it like a cane. "Y'all headed somewhere, or just collecting scenery?" His voice was Appalachian. Not deep country, but mountain adjacent. The kind of accent that flattens its vowels and trusts silence more than sentences. "South," I said through the window. "Route 56. Road's blocked about 4 miles down. Mudslide took out the shoulder and half the lane. You'd need a vehicle narrower than that sedan to squeeze through." He looked at the car. "Or you'd need to go around through Branton." "What's in Branton?" He smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone sharing a punchline they didn't find funny. "Nothing now. That's the problem. Whole town went quiet 3 days ago. Not abandoned quiet. Quiet, quiet. The doors are open, but nobody answers." Nora opened her door. Nora. She was already standing, looking at the man across the roof of the car. "How many people were in Branton?" 140, give or take. Small place. One church, one store, one opinion on everything. "And they're all gone?" "Didn't say gone. Said quiet." The distinction settled over us like a change in atmospheric pressure. The man's name was Ellis Croy. He was a farrier. Shoed horses for the farms in the valley. And he'd been trying to flip his truck back over for 2 days. It had rolled when he swerved to avoid a woman standing in the middle of a blind curve at dusk. He hadn't hit her. He'd seen her in the rear view after the truck settled, still standing in the same spot, watching the wreck with the dispassionate attention of someone observing weather. "She's still there?" Duncan asked. finally stepping out with the Remington held loose at his side. Was yesterday morning. Haven't checked since. Don't intend to. Ellis didn't ask to come with us. He told us what he knew and let the information do the asking. Branton was 5 miles east through a fire road that Ellis said was passable if you didn't mind branches scraping your paint. Beyond Branton, the road reconnected to Route 56 south of the mudslide. It was the only option unless we wanted to backtrack 40 miles and lose a day we didn't have. We were burning through fuel faster than Duncan's siphoning could replace, and the canned food in the trunk had 3 days of calories left if we stretched it. I know the fire road, Ellis said. Drove it 100 times servicing the Patterson farm. And Branton, I asked. I know Branton too. Knew anyway. The people who lived there, the layout, the back streets. If something's wrong, and something is, I know where the exits are. Duncan looked at me. I looked at Nora. She gave a small nod. Ellis folded himself into the back seat next to Duncan, and the two men regarded each other the way strangers do when they've both independently decided to survive, with a respect that hadn't yet decided whether to become trust. The fire road was exactly as described, narrow, overgrown, and brutal on the suspension. Branches clawed at the windows like fingers testing the glass. The forest closed in overhead, and the light dropped to a green-gray twilight that made it hard to judge distance. Nora kept her scanning pattern, but here there was nothing to see. Just trees and shadow and the occasional flash of a deer trail crossing the road. Ellis talked. Not nervously, practically, filling gaps in our knowledge with local intelligence. The valley had about 600 people spread across 4 small communities. Branton was the largest. When the outbreak had reached rural Virginia, the initial response had been disbelief, then anger, then the particular brand of armed self-reliance that mountain communities default to when institutions fail. People had boarded up, armed up, and turned inward. Problem wasn't the sick, Ellis said. Problem was the ones who wouldn't admit their people were sick. Charlie Dutton's wife started breathing wrong on day 4. Heavy, wet, like she was drowning standing up. Charlie told everyone she had a chest cold. She walked into the church on day 6 and stood in the aisle for the entire service without blinking. Pastor Hale asked her to sit down. She sat, stayed sitting for 11 hours after everyone left. Charlie came to bring her home that night. He paused. Nobody saw Charlie after that. You think the whole town turned? Nora asked. I think the town trusted itself more than it trusted the evidence, and the virus is patient enough to use that. That sentence stayed with me. The virus is patient enough to use that. It was the most accurate description of VRIS-7 I'd heard, more precise than anything the CDC had published, more honest than any presidential address. The virus didn't need to be fast. It just needed people to hesitate. We emerged from the fire road onto a paved 2-lane that ran straight into Branton. The town appeared gradually. A mailbox, then a fence, then a barn, then the first houses, small clapboard structures with porches and satellite dishes and American flags that had been hanging long enough to fray. It looked normal. It looked like any small Virginia town on an autumn afternoon. Every door was open, not broken open, not kicked in, simply open, as if every resident had simultaneously decided to step outside and then never return to close up. Screen doors hung at angles, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. Curtains moved in windows. A garden hose lay in a front yard, still connected to the spigot. Water long since stopped. Duncan checked the Remington's chamber by feel. Drive through. Don't stop. Agreed, I said. But Nora was leaning forward, staring at something on the right side of the road. A building. The church. White clapboard, steeple intact, front doors wide open. In the parking lot, 15 cars were arranged in neat rows. Sunday parking. Orderly, deliberate, as if every congregant had arrived at the same time and parked with the precision of people following instructions. Joel, stop. We're not stopping. There are people in those cars. I looked. She was right. In the closest vehicle. A blue Ford F-150. A figure sat in the driver's seat. Still. Hands on the wheel. Facing forward. In the car beside it, another figure. Same posture. And the next. And the next. 15 cars, each with at least one occupant, all sitting motionless, all facing the church. The breathing reached us then, not from one throat. From 15. A chorus of shallow, rhythmic respiration that pulsed through the closed windows of those vehicles and merged into a single sound, a tidal whisper that rose and fell with mechanical synchronization. I pressed the accelerator and didn't look back. In the mirror, the church shrank to a white speck, and the breathing faded, but it didn't disappear. It thinned and stretched and wove itself into the wind, and I knew the way you know a burn is going to scar before the blister forms, that I'd hear that sound for the rest of whatever life I had left. We cleared Branton in under 4 minutes and reconnected with Route 56 on the far side without incident. But the car was different afterward. Not the vehicle. The space inside it. The 4 of us had contracted into ourselves, each retreating into a private calculation of what we'd just witnessed. Duncan spoke first, because Duncan always converted horror into logistics. They were organized. They were sitting in cars, I said. In formation, facing a central point. That's not random infection behavior. That's coordination. Nora turned to look at him. The assessment phase. It's been theorized that late-stage breathers develop collective behavior. Shared stimulus response. A group of them can orient toward the same target simultaneously. Theorized by who? By researchers at Johns Hopkins before the servers went down. There was a preprint, never peer-reviewed, obviously suggesting VRIS-7 doesn't just suppress higher cognition. It replaces it with something. A simplified decision architecture that, in groups, begins to synchronize. You're telling me they're networking. I'm telling you they were all breathing at the same rate. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Ellis, who hadn't spoken since we'd entered Branton, cleared his throat. The Patterson farm is 6 miles ahead. If it's empty, there's fuel in the equipment barn and enough canned goods to restock. Dale Patterson was a prepper before prepping was fashionable. He had a diesel tank, a root cellar, and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. And if it's not empty, I asked, then Dale's still there, and he'll either help us or shoot us, depending on how the last week has treated his disposition. We found the Patterson farm at the end of a gravel drive, flanked by wire fencing. The house was a 2-story farmhouse, white with green shutters, set back from the road with a clear sight line in every direction. No trees within 50 yards of the structure. Dale had cut them back years ago, Ellis explained, because he didn't like things having cover near his home. The equipment barn was to the left, the root cellar entrance visible as a slanted metal door set into the earth behind the house. The house was closed, doors shut, windows shut, curtains drawn. After Branton's open-door gallery, the closure felt almost aggressive in its normalcy. Ellis got out first. Let me approach. He knows my face. He walked to the front porch and knocked. 3 measured knocks, a pause, then 2 more. A pattern. After a moment, the curtain in the front window moved an inch, then dropped. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was maybe 60, short and solid, with steel-gray hair pulled back and a lever-action rifle held across her chest, with the casual competence of someone who'd carried it long enough that it had become postural. Her eyes moved across our car, counted heads, assessed threats, and dismissed them in under 3 seconds. Ellis Croy, I heard your truck rolled. News travels. Sound travels. Heard from here 2 nights ago. She looked at us. Who are they? People passing through. They're headed to Harmon's Crossing. Something shifted in her expression. A tightening around the eyes, a micro-adjustment of the rifle's angle. Harmon's Crossing. You know it? I asked from the car. I know the broadcast. Heard it on the shortwave. She paused. Heard the second one, too. My stomach dropped. What second one? 3 days ago. Different voice, not the woman. A man. Said the perimeter had been breached and they were falling back to the secondary structure. Said if anyone was coming, to come armed and come fast. She looked at me with a directness that felt surgical. Then the signal went dead. Nora reached over and gripped my forearm, not in comfort, in anchoring. She could feel me beginning to drift toward the place where hope disintegrates into math, where you start calculating whether 90 miles of fuel and risk were spent chasing a signal that was already a ghost. When exactly? I asked. Tuesday morning, early, maybe 5 a.m. Today was Friday. 3 days. 72 hours in which Harmon's Crossing had gone from organized to breached to silent. Duncan from the back seat. We still going? I didn't answer immediately. I looked at the farmhouse, the cleared perimeter, the closed doors, the woman with the rifle. I looked at Nora's hand on my arm. I looked at the road stretching south into the mountains. Yeah, I said. We're still going. The woman's name was Margot Patterson. Dale, her husband, had left 5 days ago to help a neighbor reinforce a fence line and hadn't come back. She said this without tremor, without plea. She said it the way Ellis had described the church. A fact. A coordinate on a map of loss that had grown too large for grief to cover. You can fuel up, she said, and I'll open the cellar. Take what you need. But you leave before dark. I don't keep company after sundown anymore. She glanced toward the tree line beyond the cleared perimeter. The breathing starts around dusk. We took 45 minutes at the Patterson farm. Duncan filled the tank and 2 spare containers from Dale's diesel reserve. Nora and I descended into the root cellar with Margot, and the woman moved through her dead husband's provisions with the efficiency of someone dismantling a life she'd already mourned. Canned vegetables, dried beans, a flat of bottled water, a first aid kit still in its shrink wrap. She handed each item to me without ceremony, and I passed them to Nora, who carried them to the car. At the bottom of the cellar stairs, tucked behind a shelf of preserves, was a shortwave radio, a Yaesu, older model, the kind ham operators used before digital killed the hobby. It was plugged into a marine battery, and the power light was on. This is how you heard the second broadcast? I asked. Margot nodded. Dale kept it running 24/7. Said if the world ended, the last people talking would be on shortwave. She touched the dial with one finger, a gesture so intimate it felt like I was watching her hold someone's hand. I've been listening since he left, mostly static, sometimes voices, but far away, fragmented. The Harmon's Crossing broadcast was the clearest thing I've caught. Can I listen? She stepped aside. I sat on a wooden stool and put on the headphones. The frequency Margot had marked with a strip of masking tape, 7.245 megahertz, produced nothing but the soft hiss of empty air. I scanned slowly, 10 kilohertz at a time, and found what you'd expect. Ghosts. A preacher in Tennessee reading scripture in a voice that cracked every third word. A woman in Ohio repeating her coordinates, and the number of people in her group. 4 adults, 2 children. We have insulin, we need insulin. In a loop that sounded automated, but wasn't. A man speaking Spanish too fast for me to follow, his tone urgent and jagged. Then, at 7.280 megahertz, I found something different. Not a voice, a sound. Rhythmic, organic, unmistakable. Breathing. Someone, somewhere, had keyed a shortwave transmitter and left it open. And the only thing broadcasting was the sound of infected respiration. It pulsed through the headphones with a clarity that made my skin contract, not a single set of lungs, but many. Layered, synchronized, rising and falling in that wet mechanical cadence that had become the signature of everything we'd lost. I pulled the headphones off. You heard it, Margot said. Not a question. How long has that been broadcasting? Since the Harmon's Crossing signal died. Same frequency range. I don't think it's a coincidence. The implication was a cold hand on the back of my neck. If the infected had accessed a transmitter. If they'd learned. in whatever simplified decision architecture now drove them. That radio signals attracted prey. Then every survivor listening for rescue was being hunted by the very act of listening. I went upstairs and found Nora loading the last of the supplies into the trunk. Duncan was checking the tire pressure, methodical as ever. Ellis was standing at the edge of the cleared perimeter, looking south toward the mountains, with his hands in his jacket pockets. "We need to talk," I said. I told them about the broadcast, about the breathing on the frequency, about what it might mean for Harmon's Crossing, that the breach might not have been physical, that the signal itself might have been the vector, not for infection, but for congregation. A broadcast that drew survivors also drew breathers. The same sound, traveling the same distance, reaching the same ears. And whatever the infected had, instead of ears, Duncan absorbed this in his usual way. Geometry. So the signal is a beacon, and the beacon draws both friendlies and hostiles. Your woman set up a lighthouse, and it attracted the rocks. She didn't know. Doesn't matter if she knew. Matters what's waiting when we get there. Nora was quiet. She had a way of going internal when the variables multiplied, retreating into the pattern recognition architecture of her training, mapping possibilities, discarding dead ends. When she came back, her voice was measured. If the second broadcast said they were falling back to a secondary structure, that means they had a contingency, a fallback position. Ava's organized. Joel says she's organized. If the outer perimeter fell, she'd have a plan for the inner one. 3 days ago, Duncan said. 3 days is survivable if your secondary is defensible and your supplies are pre-staged. 3 days is also enough time for a coordinated group of infected to dismantle anything a handful of civilians can build. Then we go and find out, I said. Ellis turned from the tree line. I'll come. I've got nothing left here that's worth guarding. Margot appeared on the porch. She'd changed. Practical boots, a heavier jacket, the lever-action rifle now slung on her shoulder with a nylon strap. She had a pack on her back. "Mrs. Patterson," Ellis started. "I heard the breathing start early today," she said. 3 o'clock instead of dusk. It's getting closer. If I stay, I'm sitting in a house waiting for them to decide I'm worth the walk across the yard. She looked at me. "You said there might be people at Harmon's Crossing. People with a plan. I'd rather die moving toward a plan than sitting in Dale's chair listening to the dark." 5 people now. 1 car, 1 shotgun, 1 lever-action rifle, 1 tire iron, and whatever waited at the end of 90 miles of mountain road. I opened the back door for her. She got in without a word. We left the Patterson farm with 2 hours of daylight remaining. And behind us, from somewhere in the trees beyond the cleared perimeter, the breathing rose like a tide that had learned to whisper. The road south climbed through switchbacks that tightened like a fist closing. The Blue Ridge didn't welcome travelers on this side. It tolerated them, the way a sleeping animal tolerates a fly, and the hairpin turns and sheer drops were reminders that gravity was the original predator and everything else was an innovation. Duncan drove now. He'd taken the wheel after the Patterson farm without asking, and I let him because my hands hadn't stopped shaking since the headphones. He drove the way he did everything. Precisely, without excess. The steering wheel an instrument calibrated to keep us alive. Nora sat beside him in the passenger seat, navigating from the atlas. Ellis, Margot, and I were compressed into the back seat. 3 strangers sharing air and anxiety. Margot spoke to fill the altitude. Not about herself. About the valley, the people, the way things had been before. She told us about the Branton 4th of July picnic, where Hank Colfer's goat had escaped the petting zoo and eaten half the bunting off the gazebo. She told us about the ice storm of 2018 when the entire valley lost power for 9 days, and nobody complained because they'd all grown up without it anyway. She told us about Dale. Just once, just briefly. How he'd proposed to her in a hardware store because he said he wanted to build her a life and figured the proposal should happen where the materials were. She told these stories without nostalgia. She told them like evidence, proof that what was being lost had been real, had mattered, had deserved better than what was happening to it. Ellis listened. He didn't add his own stories. He sat with Margot's the way he'd sat with a tire iron at the gas station, holding what he'd been given, waiting to see what it weighed. At the crest of the pass, the road leveled briefly and offered a view. The valley below was a quilt of brown fields and bare trees stretching toward a second ridge line, and in the middle distance, a cluster of structures, rooftops, a water tower, a gravel road cutting through like a scar. Harmon's Crossing, or what had been. Duncan stopped the car. We looked. From this distance, it appeared intact. The water tower was upright. The buildings had roofs. No visible fire damage, no structural collapse. But there was no movement, no vehicles on the road, no smoke from chimneys. And in the late afternoon light, with the sun hitting the valley at a low angle, I could see something on the ground around the largest structure. A long, low building that might have been a community center or a warehouse that looked like a perimeter barrier. Vehicles, maybe. Or debris arranged in a ring. Nora had the binoculars, a pair of Nikons we'd taken from an abandoned sporting goods store in Lynchburg. She focused and scanned, and her silence lasted long enough that I knew she'd found something. The barrier is vehicles, she said. Trucks, mostly, arranged bumper to bumper in a circle around the main building. There's a gap on the south side. One truck has been pushed out of line. She adjusted. I can see the door of the building. It's reinforced. Metal sheeting bolted over the original frame. She paused. It's closed. People. No movement. But the barrier is recent. The truck beds have supplies visible. Tarps, water containers. This wasn't abandoned. It was operational. Was, Duncan said. The door is closed, Nora repeated with emphasis. If they were overrun, the door wouldn't be closed. You don't breach a defended position and then close up after yourself. She had a point. The infected didn't secure locations. They occupied them the way water fills a container, flowing in, staying until the stimulus that drew them faded, then dispersing. A closed, reinforced door suggested someone inside had sealed it. Someone alive. Or someone recently turned, Ellis said quietly. Someone who still had enough motor function to pull a door shut before the assessment phase took over. The two interpretations sat side by side like diverging roads, and we had fuel for one. We go in at first light, I said. We find high ground, we camp dark, and we approach the building at dawn when visibility favors us. Duncan nodded. Margot chambered around in the lever action with a sound like a conversation ending. Ellis folded his hands in his lap. Nora lowered the binoculars and looked at me. If she's in there, Joel, then we get her out. And if she's not, then we get out. It was the most honest exchange my sister and I had ever had. And it took 9 words total. We found a position halfway down the ridge, a rocky shelf screened by a stand of pine that offered a view of the valley floor and enough cover to hide the car. Duncan backed the sedan into the trees until only the front bumper was visible. And we made camp in the functional, joyless way that had become ritual. No fire, no light. Food eaten cold from cans. Conversation in murmurs. The sun dropped behind the western ridge and the valley turned indigo, then charcoal, then black. The sky was clear, and the stars came out with an intensity that belonged to a world without electricity. Thousands of them. Millions. A density of light so overwhelming, it felt almost aggressive. As if the universe was compensating for what we'd lost on the ground by being excessive above it. Margot and Ellis took first watch. Duncan wrapped himself in a moving blanket from the trunk and was asleep in under 2 minutes. Another of his survival calculations, banking rest the way he banked fuel. Nora and I sat with our backs against the car's rear bumper, looking down at the dark valley. Do you remember the blackout? She asked. Which one? 2003. The big one. We were kids. Mom lit candles and Dad said it was like camping. And you told me the stars were flashlights held by people who'd already died. I was 10. I was being dramatic. You were being accurate. You've always been accurate, Joel. even when you were making things up." I didn't know what to say to that. The compliment felt like a eulogy. "If Ava's dead," Nora said, "we need a next thing. We can't keep driving towards signals that go dark. We need a plan that doesn't depend on someone else's survival." "I know." Duncan's thinking it. He won't say it, but he's calculating the fuel cost of every mile we drive toward a stranger's promise. Ava's not a stranger to me. She is to him. She is to Margot, to Ellis. They came because we were moving, and movement felt like purpose. But purpose isn't survival. Sometimes purpose is the thing that kills you, because it convinces you to take one more risk. She was right, and I resented her for it the way you resent a mirror for showing you the thing you already knew was there. Below us, in the dark valley, something changed. Not a sound. A feeling. A pressure shift. Like the barometric drop before a storm, except the sky was clear. Nora felt it too. She straightened, her scanning instinct activating even in the dark. Then we heard it. The breathing. Not close. Not from the valley floor directly below us. From the settlement. From Harmon's Crossing itself. Rising out of the dark cluster of buildings like heat from pavement. Dozens of sources. Maybe more. Synchronized into that horrible wet rhythm. Amplified by the valley's acoustics into something that wasn't a sound anymore, but a presence. A texture in the air. The valley breathed, and we sat above it like climbers on the lip of a volcano, listening to the magma speak. Margot, from her position at the tree line, whispered, "That's more than what I heard at the farm." "How many?" Duncan asked. He was awake. Of course he was awake. Nora, eyes closed, listening with the analytical precision of a woman who studied patterns for a living. 60, maybe 80. It's hard to separate individual rhythms when they synchronize. But there are micro-variations, slight offsets. I'd estimate 60 to 80 individual sources concentrated in and around the main structure. 60 to 80 breathers. In and around the building where Ava might still be alive behind a reinforced door. "Well," Duncan said, with the flatness of a man reading a fuel gauge, "that changes the math." I looked at the dark. I listened to the breathing. And I began, for the first time since we'd started driving, to plan not just how to arrive, but how to extract someone from a place that had already been swallowed. Dawn came gray and cold and without mercy. I hadn't slept. The breathing had continued through the night, not constant but pulsing, rising and falling in waves that seemed to respond to stimuli we couldn't identify. Twice it had surged, the rhythm quickening for several minutes before settling back to its baseline. And both times, I'd felt my body prepare for something that never arrived. By morning, my adrenal system was wrung out, and my hands moved with the sluggish imprecision of a man operating on fumes. The plan, assembled in whispered fragments between midnight and 4 a.m., was crude but had the virtue of accounting for what we knew. Nora had mapped the settlement's layout from memory and the binocular survey. Main building at center, vehicle barrier in a ring, gap on the south side, secondary structures to the north and east, open ground between the barrier and the nearest tree cover on all sides except the west, where a creek bed offered a shallow, partially concealed approach. The approach, Duncan and I would move through the creek bed to the west side of the barrier. If the infected were concentrated in and around the building, as the sound pattern suggested, the west side would be the least occupied. We'd reach the barrier, look for a way over or through, and assess the door. If it was barricaded from inside, we'd signal. 3 knocks, pause, 2. The same pattern Ellis had used at Margot's. If someone answered, we'd negotiate extraction. If no one answered, we'd retreat. Margot, Ellis, and Nora would stay with the car at the ridge position. Margot's lever action had range. If something went wrong, they'd provide what cover they could from the elevated position and then drive. Not toward us, away. South, east, anywhere. The agreement was explicit. If Duncan and I didn't return within 90 minutes, the car would leave. Nora had fought this. Not loudly, she didn't fight loudly anymore, but with a sustained, pressurized silence that communicated more than shouting would have. When she finally spoke, it was to me alone, her voice barely audible above the pre-dawn breathing of the valley. "You're choosing to die. I'm choosing to check. It's the same thing, and you know it." "Maybe, but I'm not able to drive past." She looked at me for a long time. Then she handed me the tire iron and said, 90 minutes. Duncan and I descended the ridge in the gray half-light, moving through the trees with a slowness that made each step feel like a negotiation with the ground. The forest floor was noisy. Dried leaves, brittle sticks, and we'd wrapped our boots in strips of cloth torn from the moving blanket to muffle the impact. It helped, but not enough. Every footfall was a small announcement, and I kept waiting for the breathing below to shift, to orient, to notice. It didn't. Not yet. We reached the creek bed 20 minutes into the descent. It was narrow and mostly dry. A thin thread of water running over smooth stones and silt, and the banks were high enough to screen us from ground-level observation as long as we stayed low. Duncan went first. The Remington held close, his body folded into a crouch that looked painful but efficient. I followed with the tire iron, feeling ridiculous and underarmed, and very, very present. The creek wound toward settlement in a lazy S-curve, and as we rounded the final bend, the barrier came into view. Up close, it was more substantial than it had appeared from the ridge. The trucks were full-sized, F-250S Silverados, a flatbed. Arranged with precision, their beds packed with sandbags, lumber, and coiled razor wire. This wasn't improvisation. This was engineering. Ava's engineering. Between two trucks west side, a narrow gap had been left. Intentional, barely shoulder width, with a gate fashioned from a steel shelf unit bolted to the truck frames with heavy-duty brackets. A kill chute. Anyone approaching through the gap would be funneled into a space narrow enough that a single defender could hold it. The gate was closed, but not locked. The padlock hung from the hasp, open, the shackle pulled free. Duncan examined it without touching. "Open from inside," he murmured. "Someone left. Or someone was let in." He gave me a look that said both options were equally dangerous. We slipped through the gate and into the compound. The interior was a gravel yard, maybe 60 feet across, surrounded by the truck barrier on all sides. The main building dominated the space, a concrete block structure, single-story, flat-roofed, with a reinforced metal door Nora had described facing east. Loading dock on the north side, no windows. A building designed for storage, repurposed for survival. The gravel yard was empty. No infected visible. No bodies, no signs of violence, but the breathing. The breathing was everywhere. Inside the building, from behind the trucks, from underneath the vehicles, from the ground itself. The sound was so pervasive at this range that it lost directionality. It was ambient, atmospheric, like standing inside a lung. Duncan moved to the metal door. I followed. He pressed his ear to the surface and listened. After 10 seconds, he stepped back and looked at me. His expression was something I hadn't seen on him before. Not fear, not calculation. Bewilderment. "There's two sounds," he whispered. "The breathing, yeah. But underneath it, knocking. Faint. From deep inside, irregular, not a pattern." He paused. "Someone's alive in there and trying to get out." I pressed my own ear to the door and heard what Duncan had described. Beneath the wet chorus of synchronized breathing, a thin, desperate percussion, metal on metal. Not rhythmic, not a code. The frantic, exhausted striking of someone who'd been trying to make noise for a long time and was running out of strength to do it. The door had a heavy-duty slide bolt on the outside. A retrofit, welded onto the metal sheeting. It was engaged. Someone had locked this door from the outside, sealing whoever was inside with whatever else occupied the building. "The bolt's external," I whispered. "This door was locked from out here." Duncan understood the implication immediately. Someone sealed the building. Deliberately. Locked the living and the infected inside together. Or locked the infected inside and didn't know there were living people still in there. Or knew and didn't care. I gripped the slide bolt. It was cold. Rusted slightly from morning dew, but functional. I could open this door. I could release whatever was inside, the knocking and the breathing, the survivor and the swarm, into the gravel yard where Duncan and I stood with one shotgun and a tire iron. "How many shells?" I asked. 7 in the tube, 12 in my jacket. Against 60. Against however many are between the door and whoever's knocking. Might not be 60 in the building. Sound carries. Some could be outside the barrier, in the surrounding structures. Might. Might is what we've got. Then from inside paused. Then resumed. Weaker, slower. The person was fading. I looked at the building. Flat roof. I looked at the loading dock on the north side. A raised concrete platform with a roll-up metal door. Currently closed. I looked at the barrier trucks. "We don't go through the front," I said. "We go over." The plan reformed itself in seconds, born from desperation and the geometry Duncan had taught me to see. One of the barrier trucks on the north side was close enough to the building that its cab roof was nearly level with the building's flat roof. If we climbed the truck, crossed to the roof, and found any kind of roof access, a hatch, a vent, a skylight, we could get inside from above, bypassing whatever was congregated on the ground floor. Duncan stared at me. Then he nodded. Not in agreement, but in recognition that this was the least suicidal option available, which was not the same thing as a good option, but was all we had. We moved to the north side. The truck was a flatbed with a welded stake body, and climbing it was straightforward. Step on the tire, pull up to the bed, step on the stake rail, pull up to the cab roof. The building's roof was 2 feet higher and 3 feet across a gap. A step and a pull for someone with adrenaline. A death sentence for someone who slipped. Duncan went first. He crossed the gap like a man stepping over a crack in the sidewalk, the Remington slung on his back, and landed on the flat roof in a crouch. He scanned, then waved me over. I jumped. My foot hit the roof edge, and my momentum carried me forward onto the gravel and tar surface. The roof was exactly what I'd hoped. Flat, structurally sound, and punctuated by 2 aluminum ventilation housings and a roof access hatch with a recessed handle. The hatch was unlocked. Duncan pulled it open, and a wave of air rose from the darkness below. Warm, humid, and saturated with the breathing. Sound was overwhelming at this range, a wall of biological noise that vibrated in my sternum. I could feel each inhalation and exhalation as a physical pulse, and beneath it, faintly, the knocking continued. Closer now. The person was in the building's interior, possibly in a sealed room. Duncan pulled a penlight from his pocket and aimed it into the hatch. A ladder descended into a dark corridor. The corridor ran the length of the building's spine, with doors on either side. Storage rooms, offices, whatever the building had been before. The flashlight beam caught movement, shapes in the corridor, standing, motionless, facing different directions, 3 of them in the visible stretch. Breathers, assessment phase. Still, waiting. 3 visible, Duncan breathed. Could be more beyond the light. The knocking is coming from deeper in. Yeah. He looked at me. And for the first time, I saw something in Duncan Pace's eyes that wasn't calculation or geometry or the cold arithmetic of survival. It was the recognition that math had limits, that some variables couldn't be solved for, that at a certain point, you either moved or you didn't, and the algebra of living just became the binary of a footstep in the dark. "Cover me," I said. "With what?" "The moment I fire in an enclosed space, every breather in the building activates. Then don't fire unless I'm dead." I descended the ladder. The corridor was narrow enough that my shoulders nearly touched both walls. The floor was polished concrete, the ceiling low. Industrial fluorescent fixtures hung dead above me. The only light was the gray rectangle of the hatch above, and the penlight I held in my left hand, the tire iron in my right. The first breather was 10 feet from the ladder's base. A man, middle-aged, in work clothes, coveralls and steel-toed boots. He stood facing the wall, his forehead almost touching the surface, his breath fogging the concrete in rhythmic bursts. He didn't turn when my foot touched the floor. He didn't react to the light. He was deep in the assessment phase, locked onto some stimulus I couldn't perceive, and I was not yet whatever threshold would trigger his transition from stillness to violence. I edged past him. My shoulder came within 6 inches of his back, and I could feel the heat radiating off him. Breathers ran hot, the virus accelerating metabolism to a fever state that made their skin almost scalding. The air around him was tropical, damp, and carried a smell like wet copper and overripe fruit. The second breather was in the corridor ahead. A woman seated on the floor with her back against a door, legs extended, hands palm up on her thighs. Her eyes were open, aimed at the ceiling. Her breathing was synchronized with the man behind me. With all of them. The rhythm was a single organism distributed across many bodies, and walking through it felt like moving through the chambers of a heart. I stepped over her legs. She didn't react. The knocking was louder now. It came from behind a door at the corridor's end. A heavy fire door with a small wired glass window. I reached it and looked through. A room, maybe 20 by 20, stacked with supplies, water jugs, food containers, medical kits, batteries, an emergency shelter within the shelter. And in the far corner, a woman sat on a folding cot with a wrench in her hand, methodically striking the metal bed frame. She was thin, exhausted, her black hair matted and her eyes sunken. She wore a medic's vest over a flannel shirt. She was alive. Ava Shin. She saw the light through the window and froze. The wrench stopped mid-swing. Her mouth opened, and I saw her form a word. My name, maybe, or just the shape of surprise. But no sound came out. I tried the door handle. Locked. Not from outside. From inside. She'd barricaded herself in. The door had an interior deadbolt, and she'd engaged it. I pressed my face to the glass and mouthed, "It's Joel." She stared. Then she stood, crossed the room on unsteady legs, and looked at me through the window. Recognition arrived in stages. Confusion, disbelief, a rapid calculation of whether I was real or whether isolation and fear had finally manufactured a hallucination she wanted badly enough to answer. "Joel Marin," she whispered through the glass. Her voice was destroyed. Hoarse, barely functional. "How?" "Doesn't matter. Can you open the door?" She looked past me, into the corridor. She could see what I'd walked through. "If I open this door, the sound will reach them. They're in assessment phase. They haven't reacted to me. They reacted to the last person who tried. 3 days ago, a man named Robert opened his door down the hall and knocked over a shelf. The sound triggered a cascade. Every breather in the building activated simultaneously." Her voice cracked. He made it 8 feet. The corridor behind me was silent, except for the breathing. 60 or 80 sources. A carpet of sound that masked smaller noises. That was why my footsteps hadn't triggered them. The breathing was so loud, so constant, that minor sounds were absorbed into the baseline. But a door opening. Metal on metal. The deadbolt retracting, the hinges moving. That might rise above the threshold. "How many in the building?" I asked. "When I sealed this room, maybe 40 had entered through the main door. That was before someone locked it from outside." "Who locked it?" Her face changed. A hardness entered her expression. Not anger, but the scar tissue of a betrayal, not yet fully processed. "A man named Terrence. He was part of our group. He decided the building was lost, and that sealing it. Sealing us was the best way to contain the infected, sacrifice the few to protect the road." "How many were still alive when he locked it?" 6, including me. "I don't know about the others." I've heard knocking from 2 other rooms, but it stopped yesterday. 4 people potentially dead because a man decided containment was more important than rescue. The government's logic, miniaturized. The epidemic is contained. The building is sealed. The cost is acceptable. The breathing continues. I turned and looked back down the corridor. Duncan's face was visible at the hatch above, watching. I held up one finger. 1 survivor confirmed, and pointed to the door. He nodded. Then I looked at the breathers. The man at the wall, the woman on the floor, the others, deeper in the building, standing in their private calculations, still, patient, breathing. And I realized that the door didn't need to open. The wired glass window could break. The window was small, maybe 12 by 12 inches, but Ava was thin, dangerously thin. Thin enough, maybe, to through a 12-inch opening if we removed the wire mesh, and she exhaled everything she had. I held the pen light to the glass and tapped once with the tire iron. Gently, barely a sound. Ava's eyes widened. She understood. She pressed a blanket against her side of the glass. A sound dampener. I placed the flat of the tire iron against the window and pushed, slowly, steadily, until the glass cracked in a web pattern but didn't shatter. Then I peeled it away in sections, each piece coming free with a soft, sticky sound absorbed by the omnipresent breathing. The wire mesh behind the glass was thin gauge. I bent it back with the tire iron, folding it flat against the frame until the opening was clear. Ava removed her medic's vest. She'd been thin before the outbreak. Now she was skeletal. She fed her arms through first, then her head, and I gripped her wrists and pulled while she twisted her torso through the frame. The metal edge caught her ribs, and she bit down on a sound. I saw the cords in her neck strain with the effort of silence, and then she was through, hanging from the window frame with her feet off the ground, and I lowered her gently until her boots touched the concrete. She stood in the corridor, in the breathing dark, surrounded by the still and patient infected, and looked at me with eyes that held something beyond gratitude. It was the expression of someone returning from a place they'd already accepted as permanent. I pointed up. She followed my gaze to the hatch. She nodded. We moved. The walk back through the corridor was the longest 2 minutes of my life. Ava moved behind me, her hand gripping the back of my jacket, her bare feet silent on the concrete. She'd removed her boots and carried them because their soles squeaked. Every step was a negotiation with sound, with stillness. With the probability of 60 simultaneous triggers, we passed the woman on the floor. Ava's foot came within an inch of her outstretched hand, and I watched the breather's fingers twitch. A micro-movement, involuntary, the virus cycling some subroutine. And Ava froze. We stood there, suspended, for 8 seconds that lasted a month. The fingers stilled. We moved. At the ladder, I went up first and turned to pull Ava after me. Her arms had no strength. The wrench striking, the starvation, the 3 days of isolation in a room she'd expected to die in. And I hauled her up, rung by rung, Duncan gripping my belt to keep me from overbalancing through the hatch. She collapsed on the roof, gasping, and the sound she made was not breathing. It was its own thing. A ragged, human, gloriously irregular inhalation that had no rhythm, no synchronization, no viral architecture. It was the sound of someone who'd forgotten what uncontrolled air felt like. Duncan closed the hatch. Slowly, carefully, the rubber seal compressing with a whisper. Below, the breathing continued, undisturbed, unaware, or aware and unmoved. I didn't know which was worse. "We move," Duncan said. We crossed back to the truck cab, lowered Ava to the flatbed, and climbed down to the gravel, through the kill chute, through the gap in the barrier, into the creek bed. Ava moved on automatic, her body executing commands her mind hadn't fully issued. The mechanics of flight operating below the threshold of conscious decision. The ascent back up the ridge was brutal. The slope that had been manageable descending became a wall of loose soil and leaf litter going up. And Ava fell twice. Both times, Duncan caught her without a word, setting her upright the way you'd set a ladder back against a wall. With pragmatic care, efficient and unsentimental. Nora saw us first. She came out of the tree line at a run, stopping short when she saw Ava, taking in the sunken face and the skeletal frame and the medic's vest clutched in one hand, like a relic. "Ava Shin," I said. "I know who she is." Nora took Ava's arm, gently, on the side where the window frame hadn't cut her, and guided her to the car. Margot was already opening a water bottle. Ellis had the back door open. Ava drank. She drank the way the body drinks when it's been bargaining with organs for moisture. Desperately, mechanically, with a focus that excluded everything else. When she stopped, she looked at the group, 5 strangers and one face from a former life, and said the first full sentence she'd spoken above a whisper in 3 days. "There are 2 more alive in that building." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the weight of what she'd said and the impossibility of what it asked. "Room 4 and room 7, she continued, her voice gaining substance with each word, the paramedic reassembling herself from the wreckage. "I heard knocking from both as recently as yesterday. Room 4 is Marcus Dean. He's a carpenter. He helped build the barrier. Room 7 is a woman named Lee with her son. He's 8. An 8-year-old boy, locked in a room in a building full of breathers because a man named Terrence had decided the math of containment was worth the cost of lives." I looked at Duncan. He was already loading shells into the Remington's tube, counting by feel, his fingers moving over the brass with the fluency of a rosary. He didn't look up. "Same way?" he said. "Same way." Margot stood. "I'm coming this time. Mrs. Patterson, lever action is accurate to 200 yards. If I'm on the roof, I can cover the yard through the hatch if they activate. Better than being up here squinting through binoculars." Duncan looked at her, and something passed between them. A recognition of competence that transcended age, gender, and every other category that had mattered before the world simplified itself into the binary of breathing and not. "Can you climb a truck?" he asked. "I can climb anything that isn't moving." "Then you're on the roof." We descended again, this time 4 of us. Duncan, Margot, Ellis, and me. Nora stayed with Ava in the car, and I saw in my sister's face the understanding that she might be watching me walk away for the last time, and the refusal to let that understanding become the last thing she said. She just nodded. I nodded back. The second descent was faster. We knew the route, we knew the timing, and we were driven by something more urgent than hope. The image of an 8-year-old boy in a dark room, knocking on a door that no one had answered. At the barrier, we split. Margot went up, truck to roof, rifle ready, positioned at the open hatch with a sight line down the corridor. Ellis stayed at the gap with instructions to close and hold the kill chute if something came through the yard. Duncan and I went back inside. The building was different, not structurally, acoustically. The breathing had shifted. It was faster. The baseline rhythm had increased, and the micro variations Nora had described were narrowing, the individual offsets converging toward uniformity. The breathers were synchronizing tighter. Something had changed. I found room 4 first. The wired glass window showed Marcus Dean sitting against the wall, alive, conscious, watching the door with the steady gaze of a man who'd made peace with every possible outcome. When he saw me, he stood. I repeated the process. Blanket, glass, wire, extraction. Marcus was bigger than Ava. Broad-shouldered, thick through the chest. And the window was a fight. He left skin on the frame. He didn't make a sound. Room 7 was deeper in the building. The corridor branched, and the branch was darker. No ambient light from the hatch. Duncan's pen light was the only illumination, and in its beam, the breathers multiplied. 8 in this section, standing, sitting, one lying on the floor in a fetal position that looked almost peaceful. The breathing was faster here, louder. The synchronization was nearly complete. A single massive inhalation, a single exhalation. The building itself respiring as one organism. I reached room 7. Through the glass, a woman sat on the floor, holding a boy in her lap. Lee and her son. The boy was asleep, or unconscious, or in a state of withdrawal so deep it resembled sleep. Lee looked at me, and her face held nothing. Not hope, not fear, not despair. Absence. The emotional equivalent of a cleared hard drive. "I'm getting you out," I whispered through the glass. She didn't respond. She just stood, lifting the boy, and moved to the window. The boy went through first. He was small, too small, malnourished. His body light in my arms as I pulled him through the frame. He didn't wake. Lee followed, managing the opening with the boneless flexibility of someone who'd stopped caring about pain. We had them, all three. Marcus in front, Lee carrying the boy behind me, Duncan at the rear. We moved toward the main corridor, toward the hatch, toward the gray rectangle of sky. And the breathing stopped. All of it, simultaneously. Every breather in the building fell silent at the same instant. And the silence was worse, infinitely worse, because in the silence, the other sound was amplified. My heartbeat, the boy's shallow respiration, the creak of Duncan's jacket, the distant sound of wind through the hatch. Then, in the silence, a new sound, not breathing, movement. The soft, wet friction of bodies turning, orienting. The assessment phase ending and the next phase beginning, triggered by some collective threshold we'd finally crossed. "Run," Duncan said. We ran. The corridor exploded into motion around us, shapes peeling off walls, rising from floors, turning with a synchronization that was mechanical in its precision. The first breather reached for Marcus, and Marcus drove a fist into its chest without breaking stride. The second came from a doorway, and Duncan fired. The shotgun blast in the enclosed space was a physical force, a concussion that rang the walls and blew the breather back into the room it had emerged from. The cascade began. Every shot triggered more movement. Every movement compressed the timeline. We sprinted toward the ladder, and the corridor behind us filled with shapes converging from every branch and room. A tide of bodies moving with the terrible efficiency of a system that had finally activated its primary function. Marcus reached the ladder first and went up like he was born vertical. I handed the boy up. Lee pushed from below, Marcus pulled from above, and the child passed through the hatch like a package on a conveyor. Lee went next, then me, and as I climbed, a hand closed around my ankle with a grip that was furnace hot and mechanically strong, and I kicked. Once, twice, and felt it release. Duncan came up last. He fired twice more down the corridor, backing up the ladder one-handed, the Remington roaring, and Margot reached down and hauled him through the hatch by his collar with a strength that defied her frame. She slammed the hatch shut. Below, the building erupted into sound. Not breathing anymore, but something else, a vocalization, a frequency. A chorus of open throats producing a single sustained note that rose through the roof and into the morning air, like a signal. A signal. "They're calling." Nora's from somewhere. Alice had a walkie. "Joel, the sound is carrying. The ones outside the barrier are moving. Get off the roof now." We got off the roof. Truck, ground, yard, kill chute. Ellis had the gate open, and we poured through. The creek bed, the ridge, the climb. Behind us, the signal continued. And from the valley, from the hills, from the roads, and the farms, and the quiet places where the infected had waited, an answer came. Breathing. Hundreds of sources. Maybe thousands. Converging. We reached the car. Nora had it running. Ava was in the passenger seat, conscious, alert, already calculating. "North," she said. "The pass. They'll come from the valley floor. Take the high road." I drove. The pass road was narrow and vertical, a series of switchbacks carved into the ridgeline by someone who'd valued directness over safety. The car groaned on the grade, the engine laboring, the fuel gauge dropping with a speed that turned Duncan's face to stone. 8 people now. 1 sedan. The math was obscene. In the rearview mirror, the valley below was changing. The breathing signal from the building had done what radio signals do. It had traveled. And it had been heard. And the response was visible. Shapes emerging from tree lines, from buildings, from the roads, all moving toward Harmon's Crossing with the patient, synchronized gait of the assessed becoming assessors. Dozens, then scores, converging on the settlement, like blood returning to a wound. We crested the pass and ascended the far side, and the valley disappeared behind us. The signal faded. The breathing dimmed, but it didn't stop. It never stopped. It just became part of the distance, a frequency embedded in the landscape, like geological strata, something that had always been there, waiting for the right instrument to make it audible. Ava directed us. She knew the region from her weeks of organizing Harmon's Crossing, and her mind, that precise paramedic's mind that I'd trusted with a child's heart in a moving ambulance, mapped routes and contingencies, with a speed that made me realize how much I'd been improvising. "There's a fire station 17 miles northwest," she said. "Volunteer station, built into the mountainside. Concrete block, metal roof, single access road. The volunteers cleared out in the first week, but the structure is intact. It has a radio, and it has a diesel generator with an underground tank. How do you know it's still intact? Because nobody wants a fire station in the apocalypse. They want hospitals, grocery stores, gun shops. Fire stations are overlooked. That's why they survive." She was right. And she was already thinking beyond shelter. She was thinking about broadcast, about connection, about the next signal. The same instinct that had built Harmon's Crossing was rebuilding itself in real time, adjusting for the lesson of what had gone wrong. "The signal attracted them," I said. "Your broadcast. I know. No defensiveness, no guilt performance, just acknowledgement. The next one will be different. Encrypted schedule, randomized frequencies, short bursts. We don't build a lighthouse this time. We build a network. Nodes, not beacons." From the back seat, where he was compressed between Ellis and Margot, with the boy sleeping against his shoulder. A sight so incongruous, it nearly broke me. Duncan said, "Nodes need people. Then we find people." "And if the signal finds us first?" Ava turned in her seat and looked at Duncan with the expression I remembered from the ambulance. The one she wore when the monitors were screaming and the child was blue and the math said stop, but she kept going. "Then we move. We adapt. We keep breathing at our own rhythm, not theirs." The fire station appeared exactly where she'd said it would. A squat concrete structure built into a hillside, its single bay door closed, its windows intact, its access road steep and narrow enough that any vehicle approaching would have to come slowly and loudly. We pulled in. Duncan and Ellis cleared the building, empty, clean, undisturbed. The generator started on third attempt, and the lights came on. And for the first time in 11 days, I stood in a room with electric light and felt the warmth of a functioning heater and heard the hum of a machine that existed to serve the living. Lee put her son on a cot in the back office. Margot inventoried the supplies. Marcus began assessing the structural vulnerabilities. Ava found the radio. Nora stood next to me in the bay, looking out through a window at the mountain road we'd climbed. "You went into that building," she said. I did. Twice. I did. Why? I thought about the question. I thought about Ava's signal and Terrence's lock and the boy asleep on the cot and the woman on the floor of the corridor whose fingers had twitched an inch from Ava's foot. I thought about the government's voice on the AM band, smooth and certain, declaring the epidemic contained, while the breathing grew louder in every valley and every building and every frequency we could reach. "Because someone has to go into the building," I said. "That's the job. It was always the job. In the ambulance, on the road, in that corridor. You go in, you bring people out. Not because it's safe, because if nobody goes in, then Terrence wins. Then the lock stays on. Then the contained stays contained. And the breathing becomes the... Nora didn't say anything. She put her hand on my shoulder, and we stood there. Two people in a fire station on the side of a mountain, listening to the generator hum and the wind move through the trees and the distant, fading rhythm of something that wasn't done with us yet. But we weren't done either. The boy's name was Caleb. He woke up that evening and asked for cereal, and when Margot gave him canned peaches instead, he ate them with his fingers and said they were better. It was the first time any of us had smiled in days, and the expression felt foreign on my face, borrowed from a version of myself I wasn't sure still existed. Ava began broadcasting that night. Short bursts, randomized frequencies, encrypted schedules shared only with confirmed responders. She didn't promise safety. She didn't say the word contained. She said, "We are here. We are organized. We are breathing on our own time." Within 48 hours, 3 groups had responded. Within a week, there were 31 of us, spread across 4 positions in the mountains, linked by radio and protocol, and the stubborn, irrational insistence that survival meant more than a heartbeat. The government kept broadcasting its containment message. The infected kept breathing in their valleys and their buildings and their frequencies, and we kept moving. Not toward a destination, but toward each other, node by node, signal by signal, a network of irregular breathing in a world that wanted us synchronized. I still hear it at night, that rhythm, that wet, patient cadence. It lives in the walls and the wind and the quiet moments before sleep. But I hear other things too. Margot's stories, Duncan's arithmetic, Nora's scanning, Caleb asking for cereal. The government said the epidemic was contained. We heard it breathing, and we breathed back.